He didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part Clara Whitmore would remember calm, long after everything else faded, not the words themselves cut, not the laughter from the men standing near the post office, not the sound of boots shifting in the dirt as the crowd pretended not to watch. What she would remember was that Edmund Griggs never once looked at her face when he announced, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that he had already married someone else. 3 weeks ago, quietly, to a woman with a proper inheritance and a father who owned 2 banks. He just looked past her, like she was a fence post, like she was something in the way of where he actually wanted to go. "You should have told me from the start you had nothing," he said, still not looking. "Would have saved us both the trouble of the letter writing." Clara stood there, holding her traveling bag with both hands. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who wanted to see you cry was the worst thing you could do. If you've ever been judged before someone even knew your name, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the air change, then stay with me. Because this is a story about a woman everyone counted out before she ever had a chance to begin. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss what happens next, and hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had not come to Dust Creek looking for adventure. She had come because she was out of options, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. Back in Ohio, she had spent 31 years being the responsible one, the one who stayed home while her 2 younger sisters married well and moved away, the one who nursed her mother through a long illness and kept the household accounts and never once complained loud enough for anyone to hear. She had been useful her entire life, quietly, invisibly useful, in the way that people only notice when the thing stops being done. After her mother passed, and the house was sold to cover debts she hadn't even known existed, Clara found herself with $63, 1 trunk of belongings, and a sister in Denver who had made it clear, not unkindly, but clearly, that there wasn't room in her new life for a house guest of indefinite length. The advertisement had appeared in the back pages of a Cincinnati newspaper. Clara had almost passed over it. She wasn't the kind of woman who answered advertisements. She wasn't the kind of woman who did impulsive things. But she sat with that newspaper for 3 evenings in a row before she finally wrote the letter. Edmund Griggs of Dust Creek, Colorado Territory, had described himself as a widower of 44, with a working ranch and a need for a capable woman, willing to build something lasting. He had not written anything flowery or exaggerated. That was what had convinced her. Actually, the plain language of it. He sounded like a man who meant what he said. They exchanged 6 letters over 4 months. He had asked sensible questions. She had given sensible answers. He never once mentioned anything about money, which she had appreciated, because she had very little of it, and had said in her second letter without embarrassment. He had written back promptly. She had believed they understood each other. She had been wrong about that. Clara stood in the middle of the main street of Dust Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with the stagecoach already moving on behind her and Edmund Griggs already turning away, and she understood with the very specific clarity that only humiliation can produce that she had misread every single one of those letters. He hadn't been looking for a capable woman. He had been looking for a woman with money who could be described as capable. There was a difference, and she was standing inside it. "Mr. Griggs." She heard her own voice come out steadier than she expected. "You might have written to tell me." He paused, still not fully facing her. "Figured you'd find out when you got here." "You figured." She repeated it back to him without inflection. Not a question. Just the words, placed back down in front of him like something he'd dread-dropped. He finally glanced at her, then one quick assessment, the kind a man makes when he wants to confirm he's not missing anything worth reconsidering, and then he looked away again. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Ferris runs it. She'll set you up until the next stage east." Then he walked off. Just like that. Boot heels on packed dirt, and he was gone. The men near the post office had stopped pretending to be busy with something else. One of them, young, loose-limbed, with a smirk he hadn't quite managed to hide, said something to the man beside him. Clara didn't catch the words, but she caught the shape of it. She'd heard that shape her whole life. It was the sound of someone reducing you to a single obvious fact about yourself and finding it amusing. She picked up her traveling bag. She picked up her trunk, which was heavy, and she did not ask anyone for help, and she started walking. She did not know where she was going. She had $63 minus the stagecoach fare, which left her with 41, and no plan whatsoever. For approximately 30 seconds, walking down an unfamiliar street in a town she'd never seen, Clara Whitmore allowed herself to feel the full weight of how badly this had gone. She cataloged it honestly. The months of letters, the careful hope she had tried not to let grow too large, the way she had reorganized her expectations a dozen times on the journey west to keep them realistic, and still she had arrived at the wrong outcome. She gave herself those 30 seconds. Then she started thinking about what to do next. There was a general store on her left, a livery stable ahead, a building with a hand-painted sign that said Land Office, Surveying and Claims, a smaller building beside it with no sign at all, which might have been anything. What she needed, in order of urgency, somewhere to put her trunk, something to eat, and some kind of income that didn't involve waiting for the next stage east. Because going east meant going back, and she wasn't ready to do that. Not yet, maybe not ever. She was trying to determine whether the boarding house Edmund had mentioned was worth finding when she heard a voice behind her. That trunk's going to pull your shoulder out of the socket. Clara stopped walking. She turned around slowly because she was tired, and her shoulder actually was aching, and she was not in the mood to be charitable toward anyone who was about to offer her pity or advice. The man standing a few yards behind her was tall, not dramatically tall, just the kind of tall that means he'd had to duck through a doorframe once or twice and had gotten used to it. Dark hair, a little long at the collar, a jaw that looked like it had been set in a bad mood some years ago and had more or less stayed there. His clothes were good quality but not new, and his boots were the boots of a man who worked in them. He was looking at her trunk, not at her. "I'm managing," she said. "You're listing to the left." She looked down. She was slightly. She straightened up. "I'm still managing," she said. He didn't smile. She would learn later that Grayson Hale didn't smile easily or often, and when he did, it was usually the wrong moment for it anyway. He just looked at the trunk and then at her, and there was nothing in his expression that she recognized as pity or amusement or the particular kind of male assessment she'd been getting since she stepped off the stagecoach. He looked like a man trying to solve a logistical problem. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a reaction, more like a filing away of information. "You're the woman Griggs was supposed to meet." It wasn't a question. News apparently moved fast in Dust Creek. "I was," she said. "I'm not anymore. What are you going to do?" The question surprised her. Not because it was intrusive, it was, slightly, but because of the way he asked it. No judgment attached. Just a genuine practical question, the way you'd ask someone whose wagon had lost a wheel what their plan was. "Find work," she said. "Something that pays enough to keep me here, long enough to figure out what comes next." Grayson Hale looked at her for a moment. She got the sense that he was running some kind of calculation she wasn't privy to. "I run a ranch," he said. "Black Ridge Valley, about 9 miles out. I need someone who can manage a household and deal with my father. I don't mean nurse him, he's not sick. He's just..." He paused. "Difficult." Clara waited. "I pay fair wages. You'd have a private room." He said it all without ceremony, like a man reading from a list. "The work is hard. The hours are longer than you'd want. My father hasn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in the past 4 months. And the last woman I hired to cook left after a week." "Why did she leave?" Clara asked. Something passed across his expression. Not quite embarrassment. He threw a plate of food at the wall. Clara considered this. "Was the food bad?" She said no. "I don't know. She didn't stay long enough for me to find out." Clara looked at him. She looked at the street around her, the post office, where men were still watching from the corner of their eyes, the direction Edmund Griggs had walked, the boarding house she hadn't found yet and didn't particularly want to. 9 miles, she said. "I have a wagon. I can take you out today if you want. If you don't, the offer's good until tomorrow morning." He said it like he'd close a gate on it, precisely on schedule. Not a threat, just information. "I'll come today," she said. He nodded once. No relief, no visible satisfaction. He just picked up her trunk, the heavy one, that had been pulling her shoulder out of the socket and carried it toward a wagon hitched near the livery as if it weighed about the same as a sack of flour. Clara followed him, not because she trusted him. Exactly, she had trusted Edmund Griggs. And looked how that turned out. But because, in a town full of people who had watched her humiliation and said nothing, This was the only person who had offered her something concrete. That was enough to start with. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without waiting for help. He seemed to expect that. He climbed up on his side, took the reins, and they left Dust Creek without another word. It was only when they were past the edge of town, with the flat October land opening up around them, that Clara allowed herself to exhale fully. 9 miles, a difficult father, hard work and long hours. Worse things had happened to her today. The wagon hit a rut and lurched sideways. She grabbed the side rail. He kept the horses steady without any visible drama. "What happened to your mother?" she asked. She didn't know why she asked it. It had come out before she'd properly decided to say it. Grayson Hale didn't answer for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to. Then he said, "Died 2 years ago. Beaver. I'm sorry. It was 2 years ago." She looked at him. People can still be sorry about things that happened 2 years ago. He didn't say anything, but he didn't argue either. They drove on in silence. The land was enormous, and the sky was the kind of pale gray that happened before the first real cold of autumn settled in. She could see the mountains in the far distance, just barely, like a line someone had drawn with a shaky hand. Whatever Black Ridge Valley turned out to be, she was going toward it now. She'd figure out the rest when she got there. The sun was already dropping toward the ridge line when the wagon crested a long rise, and she got her first look at the ranch. It was large. That much was clear immediately: the main house, the outbuildings, the fencing that ran in long lines toward the horizon. She could see that it had once been maintained to a high standard. She could also see just as clearly that it wasn't anymore. Porch board was visibly warped and unpainted. The yard between the house and the barn had accumulated things that no one had gotten around to moving. 2 windows in the house had their curtains closed in the permanent defensive way of rooms that had given up being looked at. It looked like a place that had stopped trying. Grayson pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and stepped down. He lifted her trunk again, this time up the porch steps, and set it just inside the front door. Clara stepped inside. The entry hall was dusty. Not filthy. Someone had been doing the minimum but dusties in the way of a place where no one had cared about it in a long time. There was a coat rack with 1 coat on it, a side table with nothing on it, a long rug that had been expensive once and was now just a floor. Covering people walked on without noticing. From somewhere deeper in the house came a sound. A chair moving. Scrape of wood on wood, slow and deliberate, like something being moved by someone who didn't particularly want to move. "That'll be my father," Grayson said. Clara stood in the hallway of a ranch that looked like it was grieving. She had $41 and a trunk full of her own belongings and a job she'd accepted in about 45 seconds. From a man she didn't know. From down the hall, the chair scraped again. Something fell. No one called out. She took off her coat, folded it over the coat rack beside the one already there, and said, "Where's the kitchen?" Grayson pointed. She went. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. Not dangerous, just completely neglected in the way of a room that had been used only for survival and nothing else. The cast iron stove had grease built up along one side that had been there long enough to harden into something almost geological. The shelves held flour, salt, dried beans, some cornmeal, a half-empty tin of something she couldn't identify, and very little else. 3 pots hung on the wall. One of them had a crack along the base that made it useless for anything liquid. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen for about 30 seconds and took inventory. Then she started working. She wasn't thinking about the situation in any larger sense, about Edmund Griggs, about Ohio, about what her sister would say when she found out about any of it. She had found over the years that the best thing to do when everything around you had gone sideways was to find the nearest practical problem and solve it. Right now, the practical problem was that it was late afternoon. 2 men were somewhere in this house, and there was no evidence that anyone had eaten a real meal in this kitchen quite some time. She found an onion that had seen better days, but was mostly still good. She found a heel of salt pork hanging near the back door. There were potatoes in a crate on the floor, some of them going soft, but she sorted through them and found enough decent ones. She got the stove going. It took 3 tries because the flue damper had been set wrong and no one had corrected it, which explained quite a lot about the buildup on the side of the stove. And she got water heating and started working on whatever she could make from what was there. It wasn't impressive food. It was onion and potato soup with salt pork, thick enough to be filling, and a pan of cornbread from the meal she found. Plain, honest food. The kind her mother had made when money was tight and pretending otherwise would have been insulting. She had the soup going and the cornbread in the oven box when she heard footsteps in the hall. Not Grayson's, she'd already learned the rhythm of his steps, deliberate and even, like a man who moved through spaces without taking more room than he needed. These were slower, shuffling slightly, the steps of someone who had gotten out of the habit of going anywhere with any particular purpose. The kitchen doorway filled with an older man. Walter Hale was probably in his mid-60s, though he looked older than that in the way that grief sometimes adds years that aren't really there. He was built the same way a son was broad through the shoulders, the kind of frame that had once carried a lot of physical work, but something had gone slack in him. Not his body exactly. Something behind his eyes. He stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with an expression that wasn't hostile, exactly. It was more like the expression of a man who had stopped expecting anything from a situation and was simply noting that a new situation had occurred. "You're not Margaret," he said. "No," Clara said. She didn't stop stirring the soup. "I'm not. Margaret left. I know. I'm Clara Whitmore. I got here today." She glanced at him briefly, then back at the pot. "Soup's going to be about 20 minutes. There's a chair if you want to sit." There was a chair near the door to the back porch, a plain wooden one that someone had left there and no one had moved. Walter Hale looked at it for a moment like he was assessing whether sitting in it constituted some kind of commitment he wasn't sure he wanted to make. Then he sat down. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't push him to. She just cooked, and he sat, and the kitchen filled up with the smell of onion and salt pork and the particular warm smell of cornbread starting to brown at the edges, and for a little while that was enough. Grayson appeared in the doorway about 10 minutes later. He stopped when he saw his father sitting in the chair, and something moved across his face so quickly. She almost missed it. Something raw and careful at the same time. The look of a man who had wanted something for a long time and didn't quite trust it when it started to appear. He caught her eye. She gave him the smallest possible nod and looked back at the stove. He got 3 bowls from the shelf without being asked. They ate at the kitchen table, which was the first time she found out only much later that all 3 of them had sat at a table together since the previous winter. Walter ate without comment, which she chose to take as a positive sign. He ate the whole bowl. He took a second piece of cornbread when she offered it wordlessly, just extended his hand toward the pan. "It's not fancy," she said. "Didn't ask for fancy," Walter said. First full sentence he'd spoken since the kitchen doorway. She nodded. "Good, 'cause fancy wasn't on the menu tonight." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he hadn't quite managed before. His eyes were gray, the same gray as his son's, and there was still something sharp inside them. Under all that weight, he looked like a man who had been intelligent his whole life and was currently furious at himself for having become someone who didn't get out of bed before noon. He didn't say thank you. He just took his bowl to the basin near the back wall and set it down carefully, and then he went back to wherever he'd come from. Grayson watched him go. Then he said quietly, "He hasn't done that in a while." "Done what?" "Cleared his own dishes." Clara looked at the bowl, sitting in the basin. Such a small thing. Such a completely ordinary, small thing. "He'll do it again tomorrow," she said, though she had no particular basis for saying it. She just decided to say it, because Grayson looked like a man who needed something to hold on to, and sometimes that was all a sentence had to be. She was wrong, as it turned out. Walter didn't come to the kitchen the next morning, or the afternoon. She made breakfast and left a covered plate for him, and it sat on the sideboard, and she didn't know if he ate it or not. She made lunch, and the same thing happened. By mid-afternoon, she was starting to revise her assessment of the previous evening. She was also, by mid-afternoon, in the middle of cleaning the front hallway, which was not technically her job, but which had been bothering her since she arrived, when she heard something from the room at the end of the hall. Not loud, just a sound, like something being picked up and put down, over and over. She waited to see if it stopped. It didn't. She walked down the hall and knocked on the door, not tentatively. A real knock, the kind that says, "I know you're in there." "Silence, Mr. Hale," she said through the door. "I'm not going to bother you. I just want to know if you ate the plate I left this morning." "Nothing. Because if you didn't eat it, that's fine. But I'd like to know so I don't keep making too much food. I'm not trying to waste supplies." A long pause. "I ate it." His voice was muffled through the door, rough with disuse. All right? She started to turn away. It was too much salt. Stopped. The cornbread, he said, last night. Too much salt. She thought about this. I'll remember that. The soup was fine. Good. She started walking again. Margaret always put too much pepper, he said. Louder now, like he'd moved closer to the door. Thought I liked pepper because I didn't say anything. I just ate it because she looked like she was trying. Clara stood in the hallway with her dust rag in her hand. I'll go light on everything until I know what you actually prefer, she said. If you want to tell me, you can. If you don't, I'll figure it out by watching what you leave on the plate. Another long pause. Salt pork again tonight? He asked. I was thinking about it. Yes. Fine. She walked back to the hallway and kept cleaning. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, Walter was sitting at the kitchen table for breakfast. Not talking much, not talking at all, most of the time, but sitting there with his coffee, in the way of a man who has decided that the kitchen is an acceptable place to be present in. Cooked. He watched. Occasionally he said something like the coffee's too strong, or is there any more of that, or you don't need to do that now. When she started cleaning something he apparently thought was fine. She took note of all of it, adjusted what she could, ignored the rest. Grayson watched all of this from a careful distance. He was out on the ranch most of the day. There were 2 ranch hands, she'd learned. Brothers named Pete and Arlo, who lived in the bunkhouse and worked the cattle and did the heavier maintenance on the outbuildings. Grayson worked alongside them more often than not. He came in at noon and at dinner, and he watched his father with that same careful, almost held-breath attention he'd had on the first night. On Thursday evening after dinner, he stopped her in the hallway. How did you do that? He said. She had been carrying a basket of mending she'd found in the back room. Someone had let it pile up for months, clearly, and she set it down on the side table and looked at him. Do what? Get him talking. I didn't get him talking, she said. He started talking. I just didn't leave. Grayson looked at her like that answer had raised more questions than it answered. She picked up her basket and kept walking. She wasn't going to explain it any better than that, because she didn't think she could. Some things you learn to do without having a theory for them. She'd spent years living with a mother who had bad days real. Bad days. Days when everything felt like weight, and even having someone in the same room was too much, and she'd learned that the wrong kind of attention made it worse, and the right kind of attention was almost invisible. You were just there, doing something ordinary, not requiring anything. It wasn't a skill she'd chosen to develop. It was just what those years had made her. Friday brought the first real problem. She had known it was coming. Things too quiet always ran out eventually, but she hadn't expected it to come from the direction it did. She had gone into Dust Creek with Grayson to collect supplies, because the kitchen needed restocking in a serious way, and she had a list that took up both sides of a piece of paper. She stayed in the wagon while he went into the land office about some boundary dispute with a neighboring property. She gathered, though she didn't ask for details, and she went into the general store alone. The woman behind the counter was about her age, thin-faced and watchful, with the particular kind of curiosity that in a small town usually meant that information was this person's primary currency. You're the woman Grayson Hale hired, she said, before Clara had even finished saying good morning. I am, Clara said. She handed over her list. The woman looked at the list. Then she looked at Clara. You the same one Edmund Griggs left standing in the street Tuesday? Clara had been expecting this too. Small towns, yes. The woman started pulling things from the shelves. How are you finding it out at Black Ridge? Fine. Walter Hale give you any trouble? No, he threw a plate at the last woman. I heard, Clara said. He told me the food was too salty. I adjusted. The woman paused in her shelf pulling and looked at Clara with what appeared to be genuine surprise. He talked to you about the food? He's particular. That's not the worst thing. The woman was quiet for a moment, assembling the order. Then people are saying things. About you staying out there. Clara waited, saying it's not proper. Woman alone on a ranch with 2 men. She said it in the tone of someone delivering information they personally find tiresome but feel obligated to pass along. Might make things difficult for you in town. Clara watched her finish assembling the order. Do you have an opinion about it yourself? Or are you just telling me what other people think? The woman blinked. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. I think people talk because they're bored, and because you're new, and because Edmund Griggs is a fool who doesn't deserve the air he breathes. She set the last item on the counter. My name's Ruth Calloway. I've been running this store for 11 years. Clara Whitmore. She started counting out her money. Thank you for being straight with me. I'm always straight. Ruth made a note in her ledger. For what it's worth, Grayson Hale is not the kind of man people usually worry about. His reputation's fine. It's just people need something to talk about. They can talk, Clara said. I've been talked about before. It doesn't change the work. She gathered the supplies and went back to the wagon, and that was the end of that conversation. But it sat with her on the drive, back to the ranch, not the gossip itself. She genuinely didn't care much about gossip, but the underlying reality it pointed to. She was a woman alone, in a new place with no family connections and no history in this community. Everything she had was the $61 left in her bag, and the job she'd taken on 4 days ago. That went wrong. For any reason, she had very little to fall back on. She didn't share this with Grayson. He had enough to manage without her, importing her anxieties into the wagon ride. But she held it. She was always honest with herself about the shape of things, even when the shape wasn't good. The second problem arrived that same evening. She was in the kitchen after dinner when she heard Grayson's voicemails from his father's room, low and tense, the careful, controlled tone of a man trying not to raise his voice. He wasn't trying to listen. The house just wasn't large enough for conversations to be truly private. You have to sign the papers, Dad. Silence from Walter. The note comes due in 6 weeks. If we don't refinance, Aldridge can call the whole loan. Let him. You don't mean that. I've said what I mean. Walter's voice was flat, not angry, just finished. That ranch was your mother's and mine. It's not mine alone. I don't want to make decisions about it alone. She's been gone 2 years. I know how long she's been gone. Silence. Then Grayson's voice, quieter. Dad, I can't run this place without the money. I need you to go to bed. Grayson? Clara heard him come out of the room and close the door with the very particular care of a man who wants to slam it but won't. She had her back to the hallway, hands in the wash basin, and she didn't turn around. His footsteps stopped outside the kitchen door. Sorry, he said. Didn't mean for you to hear that. I didn't hear anything specific, she said, which was mostly true in the way that mattered. He came in and sat down at the kitchen table, which he hadn't done before he ate at the table, but he didn't usually sit at it afterward. He put his elbows on it and his face in his hands for a moment, just a few seconds, then straightened up and looked at the wall. There's a man named Aldridge, he said. Owen Aldridge. He holds the note on part of the ranch. My father took the loan when he was sick, my mother. I mean, when she was sick, there were medical expenses. Aldridge offered better terms than the bank, and my father trusted him because they'd known each other 20 years. He stopped. He shouldn't have trusted him. Clara dried her hands. She sat down across the table from him, not next to him across, where he'd have to look at her if he wanted to continue. What kind of terms? She asked. Balloon note. The whole balance comes due at once, 6 weeks from now. Aldridge knew my father would never have agreed if he'd been thinking clearly, but he stopped again. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was sitting in a hospital room watching my mother breathe. He would have signed anything. And if you don't pay it, Aldridge gets the East Quarter section, which has the water rights, which means the rest of the ranch becomes very difficult to operate. He looked at the table. He's been wanting that quarter section for 8 years. The loan was the long way around to getting it. Clara was quiet for a moment, turning this over. How much do you need? He named the figure. It was not small. And the bank won't refinance? I've talked to 3 men at the bank. Keep finding reasons to delay. I think Aldridge has been there before me. He said it without drama, like a man who has looked at a situation from every angle and arrived at the source conclusion and has been living with it long enough that the anger has mostly compressed into something quieter. My father won't authorize anything. He says the ranch decisions should be joint decisions, and my mother is gone, and so nothing gets decided. He's not wrong, Clara said. Grayson looked at her sharply. About the principle of it, she said. He built that ranch with your mother. It doesn't feel right to him to act like she's not a factor anymore. That's not stubbornness, exactly. That's grief. She paused. It just happens to be grief that's going to cost you the East Quarter section, if no one figures out how to work around it. He was still looking at her. You got all that from 2 days of cooking in the same kitchen as him? He talks, she said. Not a lot. But when he does, he talks about her. He told me this morning that she always kept dried lavender in the kitchen because she said it helped with headaches. He said it in the middle of a complaint about the coffee. But that's what the sentence was actually about. Grayson was quiet. The coffee was fine, by the way. she said. He just wanted to say her name. Something shifted in his face. The compressed, careful look cracked open slightly at the edges, and she saw underneath it something that was very tired and had been tired for a long time. I don't know how to talk to him, he said. I never did. She was the one he stopped. I know, she said. He looked at her. You don't know me well enough to know that. No, she agreed. But I know the pattern. Families usually have one person who holds the conversation together. When that person is gone, everyone else discovers they don't know the words to the language anymore. She stood up and went back to finishing the dishes. That's not a flaw. It's just what happens. He sat there for another minute. Then he got up and went to his room without saying anything else. She finished the dishes. She banked the fire in the stove for the morning. She checked that the back door was latched. She was almost to her own room when she noticed that Walter's door was not fully closed. She could see a thin line of lamplight under it, and from inside, the slow, irregular sound of someone who couldn't sleep turning over in a bed. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to her room and took out the small journal she kept for years, not a diary exactly, more of a record of useful things, recipes, household accounts, notes about what worked and what didn't in various situations. She went to a blank page and wrote down what Grayson had told her about Owen Aldridge and the balloon note and the East Quarter section. She didn't know why she wrote it down. Force of habit. She was a person who wrote things down. She looked at what she'd written for a while. Then she went to sleep. The following week moved in a rhythm she hadn't expected to settle into so quickly. She was up before anyone else always had been. That wasn't the ranch. That was just how she was built and had coffee going, and the stove hot before either Hale was awake. She'd figured out Walter's preferences. By the end of the first week, coffee strong, food lightly seasoned, nothing too wet, nothing that required a lot of effort to eat. Simple preferences, plainly communicated. Once he'd decided she was going to stay long enough to remember them, he started talking more. Not about anything in particular, not in the way of someone making an effort at conversation, more like a valve that had been stuck for a long time and was slowly working itself free. He talked about the ranch in its better years, about a particular horse he'd had for 16 years and still thought about a winter when the snow had come in October and they'd lost 6 head of cattle, and he'd had to go out in it 3 times a day for 2 weeks to keep the rest of the herd alive. He never talked about his wife directly. He talked around her, constantly. The lavender in the kitchen. The quilt on the back of the chair in the sitting room, which Clara now knew had been made by Eleanor Hale in the first year of their marriage. The blue cup that sat on the top shelf and was never used because it had been her favorite, and he couldn't bring himself to put it anywhere else. But Clara listened. She didn't try to do anything with what she heard. She just listened and remembered, and kept showing him up at the same time every morning with coffee the way he liked it. On the 9th day, she was in the kitchen when she heard something she hadn't heard before in that house. Walter was in the sitting room, and he was not silent. He was talking. Not to her, she wasn't in the room. He was talking to Grayson. She could hear the murmur of their voices, not the words, but the rhythm of it back and forth, like men who are disagreeing about something but have decided to keep disagreeing about it instead of shutting down. It lasted about 20 minutes. Then she heard Grayson's boots cross the sitting room floor and the front door open and close. When she brought Walter his afternoon coffee, she'd started doing this, just leaving it on the table beside his chair. Without ceremony, he looked different. Older, somehow, but also more like himself. Like he'd used up something that had been sitting in him too long. I'm going to sign the papers, he said, without preamble. She set the coffee down. All right, not because I've stopped being angry about it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Because Eleanor would have told me to stop being an idiot and sign the papers. She would have said the ranch isn't her. The ranch is something we made together, but she's not inside it. And she would have been right. He looked at the window. She was usually right. Clara sat down in the chair across from him, the one she'd started sitting in occasionally, when he seemed like he wanted company rather than solitude. Sounds like a smart woman. Smarter than me. He said it matter-of-factly. Smarter than Grayson, too, though he doesn't think so. He glanced at her sideways. You're smart, too. Different kind. She raised her eyebrows slightly. You're practical, he said. Eleanor was practical, but she felt things loudly. You feel things quietly. I've been watching. I've noticed, she said. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. You don't miss much. I miss plenty, she said. I just pay attention to what I can't afford to miss. He was quiet for a moment. Then Edmund Griggs is a small man. Always was. I knew his father. Small men run in that family. Clara looked at him. He was looking out the window. Just saying, he said. He doesn't represent anything about you. He represents something about himself. She didn't say anything. She looked at the blue cup on the top shelf. Thank you, she said finally. Not for the comment specifically, just in general. For sitting in the kitchen chair, for eating the soup, for using a sentence like that on her behalf. He nodded once, the nod of a man who considers the matter noted and complete. She got up and went back to the kitchen. On the 11th day, she found the letter. Samano Kilkines. She had been cleaning the back room, the storage room behind the kitchen that had accumulated years of household overflow, and she was sorting through a crate of old papers and household documents, looking for anything that might be relevant to the ranch's current situation, because she was the kind of person who sorted through things, and she couldn't help herself. The letter was in an envelope near the bottom of the crate. It was addressed to no one, no name on the outside, and it had been opened and folded and put away, not thrown out. She almost set it aside. She wasn't in the habit of reading other people's private correspondence. But the name on the return address caught her eye. The name was Whitmore, her own name. In handwriting she recognized. Her brother Caleb's handwriting. She stood in the storage room, holding the envelope, and her thoughts went very still, in the way thoughts do right before they reorganize themselves into a completely different shape. Caleb had written to Edmund Griggs. She could see it from the outside of the envelope. Her brother's careful, slightly cramped script. The return address was their family home in Ohio, the same house she'd grown up in. She looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she unfolded the letter inside. She read it once quickly, and then she sat down on the crate and read it again slowly, because she needed to make sure she was understanding what she was reading. Caleb had written to Edmund Griggs before she arrived. Weeks before. He had written to tell Edmund that Clara had no money, which Edmund had claimed not to know, but clearly had known, and to suggest, in terms that were carefully polite but unmistakable in their meaning, that Edmund would be doing the family a favor by not going through with the arrangement. He had called her a burden, not in those exact words, but in words that meant exactly that. He had said that the family was concerned about Clara's future, and that her physical condition, he had used the phrase. Her physical condition? She read it twice to make sure made her unlikely to manage the demands of frontier ranch life, and that he hoped Edmund would consider releasing her from the arrangement rather than creating a situation that would prove difficult for everyone involved. He had written this without telling her. He had written this and then watched her pack her trunk and buy her stagecoach ticket and leave for Colorado, knowing what was waiting for her when she arrived. Clara sat on the crate in the back room of a stranger's ranch house in Colorado Territory, and she held the letter in her hands, and she sat with this for a while. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear Pete and Arlo doing something with the fence on the east side. Somewhere in the house, Walter was in his chair. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She folded the letter back up carefully. She put it back in its envelope, put the envelope in her apron pocket. Her hands were steady. She noticed that with a kind of detached interest. She had expected them to shake, and they weren't shaking. He let out a short, ugly laugh. She got up and went back to sorting the crate. There was more work to do, and she was going to do it, and she was going to figure out what the letter meant and what she was going to do about it. But not right this second. Right now, she was going to keep her hands occupied and her head clear, and she was going to let the information settle into her properly before she decided anything. What she knew, sitting there in the back room, with her brother's letter in her apron pocket, was this. She had not been sent to Colorado to find a life. She had been sent to Colorado to disappear from one. There was a difference. And she was going to have to decide, carefully and clearly, what she intended to do about it. She kept the letter in her apron pocket for 3 days. She didn't take it out and read it again. She didn't need to. She had the whole thing memorized by the end of the first hour after finding it, the way your mind will do with something that has rearranged the furniture of your understanding. She just kept it there, close the way you keep something you haven't decided what to do with yet. She cooked. She cleaned. She sat with Walter in the afternoons and listened to him talk about a horse that had died 12 years ago, and a winter that had nearly broken the ranch, and the particular way Eleanor had laughed when something genuinely surprised her, a sound, he said, like she hadn't seen it coming at all, and was almost annoyed about it. She brought Grayson coffee in the morning. when she heard him up before dawn, which was every day, and she didn't try to make conversation out of it, which she'd figured out was what he needed, not the silence exactly, but the company inside the silence. She kept the letter, and she let the information work through her, like something bitter that had to be processed before she knew what it had done to her. On the third night, she sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in her hand, and she read it one final time, and then she folded it very precisely and put it in the inner pocket of her trunk, beneath the winter dress she hadn't unpacked yet. She knew what it meant now. She'd given herself enough time to be sure she wasn't reacting from the rawest edge of it. Caleb had not just warned Edmund off. He had, in writing, characterized her as someone who was physically unsuitable, financially worthless, and essentially a problem to be managed, rather than a person with her own future to build. He had done this without her knowledge, and without apparent guilt about it, because there had been no follow-up letter, no telegram to check on her arrival, nothing. She had been dispatched west, and her brother had presumably gone back to whatever his life was and not thought about it again. What made it worse? What made it specifically, precisely worse, was that she understood the logic of it. Not the morality, the logic. Caleb had 2 children and a wife and a business that was struggling and a sister who had been living on the edges of his obligations for 2 years since their mother died. From a purely practical standpoint, getting her permanently settled somewhere else had been the goal, and if that somewhere else didn't work out, well, she was there now. She was someone else's problem. She had been managed. Efficiently and without cruelty, in the way that people manage problems they don't want to look at directly. She sat with this until it stopped feeling like something happening to her and started feeling like information about the world she lived in. That was the only way she knew how to handle things that couldn't be undone. Then she made a decision. She was not going back to Ohio. She was not going to write to Caleb and demand an explanation. She was not going to collapse or disappear or make herself small enough that no one felt inconvenienced by her existence. She was going to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go that had been true when she stepped off the stagecoach, but it wasn't entirely true anymore, and she needed to be honest about the difference. She was going to stay because the work here was real, and the people here had begun, in their difficult and unsentimental ways, to matter to her, and because she had made a decision that morning, 3 days ago, that she intended to keep. She was not going to let other people decide what she was worth or where she belonged. That was the decision. She made it and went to sleep. What she did not expect was what happened the next morning. She was at the stove with the coffee already going and the biscuits in the oven when she heard the sound of a wagon coming up the ranch road. Not Pete or Arlo, they were already out back with the cattle. This was a single horse, moving at a businesslike pace, and it stopped in the yard. She looked through the kitchen window. The man who climbed down from the wagon was somewhere in his heavyset, with the kind of expensive coat that a man wears specifically so other men notice it's expensive. He had a wide face that had settled into the particular arrangement of someone who had spent a long time being accommodated. He stood in the yard and looked at the ranch house with an assessing expression, the way you'd look at something you were already calculating the value of. She knew who he was before Grayson told her. She had filed away enough information about Owen Aldridge over the past 2 weeks that she recognized the type, if not the specific face. Grayson came in from the barn at almost the same moment, saw the wagon, and stopped. Something in his posture changed, not dramatically, just a straightening, a setting, like a man who has been expecting this and has been preparing for it and is not quite ready, but is going to act like he is. Stay inside, he said, without looking at her. She said nothing. She turned back to the stove and listened. They talked in the yard. She could hear the shape of it through the kitchen window. Aldridge's voice was the kind that carried a without effort, the voice of a man who'd never had reason to lower it, but not every word. What she caught was enough. Aldridge was there about the note. He had, apparently, done his own calculations about the refinancing attempts, and had arrived at the conclusion that Grayson was not going to be able to come up with the money, and he was there very kindly, very reasonably to discuss options. The word options landed with the particular weight that certain words carry when they don't mean what they claim to mean. I'm not interested in discussing options, she heard Grayson say. The note is due in less than 6 weeks, son. I know when it's due. Your father signed it, in good faith. I think he'd want to handle this like reasonable men. My father signed it when he wasn't in a condition to understand what he was signing. You knew that. A pause. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Another pause. Longer. She could almost feel Aldridge recalibrating the way a man does when the easy approach hasn't worked and he's deciding how much pressure to apply. I like this ranch, Aldridge said. I always have. Your mother did a beautiful job with the garden on the south side. A deliberate pause. I'd hate to see it go to someone who doesn't appreciate what it represents. The silence that followed lasted about 5 seconds. Counted. Then Grayson said very quietly, "Get off my property." She heard the wagon leave. She had the coffee poured and on the table when Grayson came back inside. He looked at her. He looked at the coffee. He sat down. "He's not just a creditor," he said. "I know," she said. "He's been working toward this for years." The loan was... He stopped. My father trusted him. They shook hands over it. My father believes a handshake means something. It should, Clara said. The problem is it only means something when both people at the handshake mean it. He wrapped his hands around the cup. I have to find the money, or I have to find a way to challenge the note. The note's legal. I've had 2 people look at it. He looked at the table. But the circumstances around how it was signed. Who looked at it? A man in town who does contracts, and a lawyer in Colorado Springs I wrote to. What did the lawyer say? Said it would be hard to prove coercion. Said I'd need evidence that my father didn't understand what he was signing, and that Aldridge knew it. Said he stopped. Said even if I had that, the judge in this county has ruled in Aldridge's favor 3 times in the past 5 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. The judge. His name is Beaumont. He and Aldridge play cards together on Friday nights. Have for 20 years, from what I understand. She took this in. Then, do you have anyone who was there when your father's and a witness? The signing happened in Aldridge's office. 2 of his own men were witnesses. He looked at her. You see the problem. She did. The problem was architectural. Every piece of it had been arranged by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had been careful about it for a long time. Is there anyone who knew your father's state of mind around that time? A doctor? The hospital. There was a doctor. He looked up. Dr. Pierce. He treated my mother. He knew. He stopped. And something shifted in his expression. Something that looked like a possibility that hadn't occurred to him before. He came to the house twice that week. He would have seen my father. And is he still in the area? He retired. Moved to Pueblo, I think. He was looking at her with the expression of a man recalculating. I never thought to contact him because I didn't think a doctor's account of a man's emotional state would hold up against a signed legal document. It might not, she said honestly, but it might change the shape of the conversation. If Aldridge knows there's a doctor who can testify to your father's condition, it changes what going to court would cost him. She paused. Sometimes that's enough. He was quiet. She could see him thinking. How do you know that? He said. My father had a business partner who tried something similar with our family's property when my father died. Not the same situation, but I watched my mother figure out how to fight it. She looked at her coffee. She didn't win, but she made it expensive enough for him that he settled for less than he originally wanted. He was still looking at her. What happened to the property? We lost most of it. She said it without drama. But we kept the house, and we kept it on our terms, not his. She met his eyes. That's not a victory exactly, but it's not nothing either. He nodded slowly. I'll write to Dr. Pierce. Write today, she said. Don't wait for it to feel like the right moment. Those moments don't usually come on schedule. He almost smiled at that. Almost. That afternoon, while Grayson was in his office writing letters, something happened that Clara had not anticipated and that rearranged everything she thought she knew about the situation at Black Ridge Valley. Walter came to find her, not the other way around. Not because she'd left food somewhere or knocked on his door. He walked into the back room where she was reorganizing the storage shelves, a project she'd been working on in pieces for days, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided to do something he's been putting off. I want to show you something, he said. She set down what she was holding. All right. He led her through the house to the sitting room, past the blue cup on its shelf, past the quilt on the chair, and then to the far wall where there was a cabinet she'd assumed held glassware or household records. He opened it. Inside on the top shelf was a wooden box, small and plain with a simple metal clasp. He took it down, he carried it to the table and set it there. And then he looked at it for a moment without opening it, like he was saying goodbye to the version of himself who hadn't shown it to anyone yet. Then he opened it. Inside was a collection of things not randomly accumulated, but deliberately kept. A folded piece of paper. A small pressed flower, brown and dry with age, but still recognizable as something that had been picked carefully and preserved carefully. A thin ring that was too small for any of Walter's fingers. A photograph, slightly creased, of a woman Clara didn't know who was smiling at the camera with the look of someone who had been caught mid-law and hadn't quite recovered. Walter touched the edge of the photograph, not picking it up, just touching it. Eleanor kept this box, he said. Called it the real account book. Said the land records and the business files were the official story of the ranch, but this was the actual one. He paused. I found it after she died, in the back of the wardrobe. She'd never shown it to me. Clara looked at the box, at the pressed flower, at the ring. She saved all of it, Walter said. Every piece of it. The paper at the bottom there. He nodded at it, didn't touch it. That's the deed. The original deed for the first 20 acres. When it was just 20 acres and we had one cow and half a hay baler that didn't work properly. Something in his voice shifted. She saved the deed because she said it was the beginning. She said you had to know where you started so you could measure how far you'd gone. Clara didn't say anything. Grayson doesn't know about the box, Walter said. I haven't been able to... He stopped. I found it and I put it away and I've been finding reasons not to take it out again. He looked at her with those tired, sharp gray eyes. You're wondering why I'm showing it to you instead of him. A little, she admitted. Because he gets the same look on his face she did, Walter said, when she was trying not to feel something. This careful look. And I can't... He stopped again, pressed his lips together. I can't do that conversation yet. With him. He looked at the box. But I could do it with you. You don't have the same stake in it. Clara sat down. Not invited, she just sat. Because he was going to need someone sitting across from him for this. Tell me about the 20 acres, she said. And he did. He talked for almost 2 hours. She'd never heard him talk for that long, continuously, and she understood partway through that this was likely the first time in 2 years he'd talked for that long about anything that actually mattered to him. He talked about the beginning, buying the land with borrowed money and his own back, and Eleanor's absolute refusal to consider the possibility that it wouldn't work. He talked about the years of building, of adding acreage and stock and outbuildings, of the winter that nearly broke them, and the summer that saved them, and the decade that had turned 20 acres into something real. He talked about Eleanor the way you talk about someone who had been so fully present in every piece of a thing that separating them from the thing itself is nearly impossible. He didn't cry. She hadn't expected him to. He was not a man who cried, she had figured out. He was a man who went very still, and looked fixed point, and spoke in the careful, even tone of someone keeping themselves together through the precision of their words. When he was done, he closed the box. He needs the ranch, he said. Grayson, he's put everything into it, more than he knows how to say. He looked at her. I've been holding things up because He stopped. Because deciding things alone felt like admitting she was really gone. She is really gone, Clara said gently. I know that. The ranch is still here, and so is Grayson. Walter looked at the closed box for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the kind of finality that meant he was moving something from one column to another inside himself. The next morning, he asked Grayson to bring the papers to the sitting room table. Clara stayed in the kitchen. She didn't need to see it. She knew it was happening because the house sounded different, the specific quality of silence that happens when something important is being done quietly by people who don't need an audience. She made biscuits and waited. When Grayson came to the kitchen doorway, he looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy after carrying it for a long time. Not relieved exactly, just different, lighter in a way that hadn't been there before. He didn't say thank you. She didn't want him to. Instead, he said, "The papers are signed." And she said, "Good," and that was enough. What came after the signing was harder in some ways than what had come before it. Because with the papers signed, the immediate crisis had a potential solution, or at least a path toward one, but Aldridge was still there, still holding the note, still with 6 weeks on the clock and a county judge who played cards with him on Fridays. Writing to Dr. Pierce was a start, but they hadn't heard back yet, and there were too many variables they didn't control. Clara was thinking about this 3 days later when she was in town with Grayson for supplies and she walked past the land office, and, on an impulse she didn't fully examine before acting on it, went in. The man behind the counter was younger than she'd expected for a land office, maybe 25, his fingers, and a pile of documents on his desk that suggested he was genuinely busy rather than just performing busyness. He looked up when she came in. "Help you?" "I'm hoping so," she said. "I'm trying to understand how a balloon note works in this county if there's a dispute about the circumstances of signing. Is there a public record process? Anything that would need to be filed?" He looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone who fields questions from people with legal problems all day and has learned not to have visible reactions to any of them. "Depends on the nature of the dispute. If you're challenging the note itself, that goes through the district court. If you're challenging a lien, that's different." "What if the argument is about the signer's capacity at the time of signing?" He put his pen down. "That's a probate argument, technically. Not my area." But he paused. "Are you talking about the Hale note?" She looked at him. "Aldridge has filed 2 extensions on other properties in this county," the young man said, quieter now. "Different situations, but the same pattern. Always someone who signed when they weren't." He stopped. "I shouldn't be saying this." "Why not?" He looked at the door. "Because Aldridge has friends in this building, and I've only been here 8 months, and I need this job." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just asking what you know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. He laid it on the counter. He didn't hand it to her. He laid it on the counter and turned away to do something at his shelf. She looked at it. It was a record of property transactions in the county for the past 8 years. She didn't have time to read all of it, but she ran her finger down the entries, quickly looking for Aldridge's name, looking for the pattern the young man had described. She found 3 entries, 3 different properties, 3 different circumstances. One was a widow with a sick son. One was a man who'd been in a mining accident and had been, by all accounts, badly concussed for months afterward. One was an elderly couple who'd signed something in the office of Aldridge's lawyer during a period when their daughter had apparently been threatening to contest their property arrangements in court. Same structure every time. A loan at better than bank terms, offered at a moment of vulnerability. A balloon note due at a point calculated to be difficult. A quiet, steady pressure toward the outcome Aldridge had wanted from the beginning. 3 properties, all now under Aldridge's name or his company's name. She memorized what she could. She stepped back from the counter. The young man turned around. He picked up the folder and filed it without looking at her. "You didn't find anything useful in the public records," he said. "Not yet," she said, "but I appreciate your time." She walked out. She sat in the wagon and waited for Grayson, and she thought about what she'd seen. 3 properties, the same pattern. That was not a coincidence, it was a practice. A calculated, long-running practice that had worked reliably enough that Aldridge had used it at least 3 times in 8 years, which meant there were at least 3 other families who'd lost land under similar circumstances. And if those families could be found, if someone could talk to them, then the coercion argument stopped being about one man's grief over his wife and started being about a pattern that a court would have to look at differently. She was still sitting with this when Grayson came back to the wagon with the supplies. "You look like you're doing math," he said. "I am," she said. "The kind where you need information I don't have yet." He put the supplies in the back and climbed up. "What kind of information?" "The names of 3 families who lost property to Aldridge in the past 8 years. He looked at her sideways. "How do you know about those?" "Public Records Office," she said. The man at the counter was very helpful. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I know one of those families. The Brennan widow. Margaret Brennan. She's still in the county, moved to a smaller place near the South Ridge." He took the reins. "I heard she'd always said Aldridge pushed her into signing when she wasn't thinking straight after her husband died. But no one did anything about it. Because she was alone," Clara said. "And one person's account is easier to dismiss than 3. He looked at her. Really looked. The way he'd been doing more often lately, not the logistical assessment of those first days, but something more careful, more like someone trying to take proper stock of a thing he'd underestimated. "You went into the land office to find this," he said. "Yes, on your own, without saying anything to me. I didn't know what I'd find. I didn't want to build something up that might not be there." He was quiet. Then Clara, she looked at him. "This is my fight," he said. And the way he said it, not harsh, not dismissive, but careful. like a man who needs to draw a line clearly. Because the line matters to him, she heard something underneath it. The same thing she heard when Walter said the Ranch Y was his and Eleanor's together. The same particular pride that comes from people who have built something and cannot separate themselves from the need to defend it themselves. I know it is, she said, but you've been fighting it alone for 2 years, and Aldridge has been setting this up for 8. You don't have to let me help. But I'd suggest thinking about whether pride is something you can afford right now. The words came out more direct than she'd intended. She waited to see how he'd take it. He didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, and the wagon moved along the track back toward Black Ridge, and the October skies was doing what it did in Colorado at that time of year, turning colors that seemed too large for any single sky to contain. Margaret Brennan, he said finally, I can take you to see her. When? Tomorrow if she'll receive us. He paused. She will. She's been trying to tell someone about this for 3 years. She just hasn't had anyone willing to listen. Clara looked at the road ahead. Then we'll listen. He nodded. And then, after another long pause, I shouldn't have said it was only my fight. She didn't make anything of it, just nodded once. We'll go tomorrow morning. They drove the rest of the way in the kind of quiet that had changed its quality since those first days, no longer the absence of things to say, but something more like 2 people thinking alongside each other, which was its own kind of conversation. That night, Clara wrote 3 pages of notes by lamplight, what she'd seen in the land office, the pattern across the 3 properties, the names and approximate dates, what Grayson had said about Margaret Brennan, what she remembered of her mother's fight over their own property, and what had worked and what hadn't. She was still writing when she heard footsteps in the hall, stopped outside her door. A knock, quiet. She opened it. Walter was standing there in his nightclothes, with the wooden box under his arm and an expression on his face that she recognized as the expression of a man who has been awake for a long time, making a decision. The deed in this box, he said. The original deed for the first 20 acres. He held the box out toward her. Eleanor kept it separate from the legal files, because she didn't trust those. She said the paper in this box was the one that mattered, if anything ever went wrong. He paused. I don't know if it matters now, but I think you should have it. You seem to know what matters and what doesn't. She looked at the box. At him. I'll keep it safe, she said.
I know you held it out.
That's why I'm giving it to you and not the bank. Took it. He went back down the hall to his room. She stood in her doorway holding Eleanor Hale's box, and she thought about a woman she'd never met who had kept a deed in a wooden box at the back of a wardrobe because she wanted to remember where she started and how far she'd gone. She thought about a letter from her brother that was in the inside pocket of her trunk. She thought about Edmund Griggs, who had looked past her like she was a fence post. She went back to her desk, and she set the box beside her notes, and she kept writing, because there was still work to do, and the morning was coming, and Margaret Brennan was waiting, even if she didn't know it yet, for someone to finally show up and listen to what she had to say. Margaret Brennan lived in a small house at the end of a dirt track that needed another name, because calling it a road was being generous. The house itself was solid enough. Someone had built it to last, even if no one had been maintaining it with any particular enthusiasm, but it had the quality of a place that had been downsized into rather than chosen. The kind of house you end up in, not the kind you pick, came to the door before they knocked. She'd heard the wagon. She was somewhere in her late 50s, with gray-streaked hair pinned back practically, and hands that had clearly done decades of real work. She looked at Grayson first, the recognition of a face she knew from the county, not a close acquaintance, but a known quantity. And then she looked at Clara with the particular careful attention of a woman who has learned to read strangers quickly, because getting it wrong is expensive. Grayson Hale, she said. Not a question, Mrs. Brennan. Sorry for coming without sending word first. This is Clara Whitmore. She works at Black Ridge. Margaret Brennan looked at Clara for another moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. Come in, then. I've got coffee. The inside of the house was neat in the way of someone who has fewer things and takes care of them, because there's nothing to replace them with. A small table. 4 chairs, though Clara got the sense only one of them was used regularly. A shelf with a few books and a photograph in a plain frame that she didn't look at directly, because it wasn't her photograph to look at. They sat at the table. Margaret put coffee down without ceremony and sat across from them with her hands wrapped around her own cup, waiting. We're here about Owen Aldridge, Grayson said. Something in Margaret's face didn't change exactly, but it settled. Like she'd been waiting for this specific sentence for a long time, and had stopped expecting it, and now here it was. I figured, she said. Heard he's after the east quarter of your place. He holds the note on it, due in 5 weeks. Same thing he did to me, she said. Except mine was the whole south field. 40 acres. She looked at her coffee. My husband had been dead 6 weeks when Aldridge came to see me. Said he'd heard I was in a difficult position financially. Said he wanted to help. Said the terms were better than the bank, and I wouldn't have to deal with the bank people, who'd never been particularly kind about doing business with a woman alone. She paused. All of that was true, which made it hard to see what was underneath it. Did you understand what you were signing? Clara asked. Margaret looked at her directly. I thought I did. He explained it clearly, or I thought he did. What I didn't understand was that the balloon clause was written to come due at exactly the point when I'd have the least amount of cash on hand because of the season. He knew the farming calendar. He knew exactly when to time it. She pressed her lips together. I've been saying this for 3 years. To anyone who'd listen, which hasn't been many people. The county judge, Clara said. Aldridge and Beaumont were in the same fraternal organization for 20 years before Beaumont got appointed. Margaret said it flatly, without visible bitterness, the way you say things you've long since finished being angry about, because the anger just lives in you now. I went to Beaumont's court in the 3rd year. My lawyer, such as he was, the only one I could afford, said we had a good argument. We left with nothing. Clara had her notes from the previous night folded in her pocket. She took them out and laid them on the table. There are 2 other properties. A man named Harlan Coe, Margaret said immediately, and before him the Dempseys. Old couple on the north side. She looked at the notes. How did you find them? Public records at the land office. Margaret raised her eyebrows slightly. The young man there, Tobias, he showed you? He left a folder on the counter and turned away, Clara said. Something moved in Margaret's expression. Not quite a smile. He's a decent young man in a difficult position. She looked back at the notes. Harlan Coe moved away, went to his daughter's place in New Mexico after he lost the property. I don't know if he'd come back to testify. She paused. The Dempsey's May Dempsey is still alive. Her husband passed 2 years ago. She lives with her son in Pueblo now. Pueblo, Grayson said. That's where Dr. Pierce retired to. Clara looked at him. I wrote to Dr. Pierce 4 days ago, he said, about my father's condition when he signed. Haven't heard back. Pueblo's 3 days by post, Margaret said. Give it another week. She looked at Clara. What are you planning to do with all of this? I don't know yet, Clara said honestly. But Aldridge has done this at least 3 times before your place, and 1 time after. That's a pattern. A judge who's honest would have to look at a pattern differently than he looks at one isolated case. Beaumont isn't honest. Beaumont isn't the only judge in Colorado territory, Clara said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at Grayson. Your mother would have liked her, she said. Grayson didn't say anything. Clara watched him absorb it, the quick flash of something in his face that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. If I come forward again, Margaret said, and it doesn't work if Beaumont or whoever it is rules against us again, I lose what's left. The house. This. She looked around the small room. I'm not saying I won't do it. I'm saying I need to know you've thought about what happens if we fail. I've thought about it, Clara said. I don't have a way to guarantee it works. I can't promise that. What I can tell you is that I've been watching how this is set up, and there are gaps in it that Aldridge didn't account for. He didn't account for 3 of his cases being in the same county records. He didn't account for a doctor who treated Walter Hale during that period. And he didn't account for. She stopped. She had been about to say something she hadn't told Grayson yet. She had been about to say he didn't account for the fact that I have a particular skill for finding the thing people don't realize they left visible. She adjusted. He didn't account for someone taking the time to connect the pieces. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she said, all right, tell me what you need from me. They stayed for 2 hours. When they left, they had Margaret's signed account of the Aldridge loan, written in her own words, witnessed by all 3 of them, and the name and approximate address in Pueblo of May Dempsey, who Margaret said was sharp as a tack and angrier about what had happened to her property than anyone Margaret had ever met, and had been angry about it for 6 years, without anyone giving her a reason to do anything productive with that anger. On the drive back, Grayson was quiet for a long time, not the thinking alongside each. Quiet of recent days, this was something different, something that had a question in it that he was trying to figure out how to ask. She let him find his way to it. It took about 4 miles. The letter, he said. The one you found in the storage room. You've been carrying something since then. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to tell me what it was, he said. I've been watching you work through something. You don't stop working, but something else is happening at the same time. He kept his eyes on the road. I wanted you to know I noticed, in case it mattered. She sat with this for a moment. It was from my brother, she said. He wrote to Edmund Griggs before I came here. He told him to end the arrangement. She paused. He said I was a burden. Grayson's hands on the reins went still for just a moment. Then he kept driving. He didn't say it in those exact words, she said. But that was what the sentence meant. More silence. The kind that's doing something. What are you going to do about it? He said finally. Nothing yet. I'm still deciding. She looked at the road. I have a habit of waiting until I know exactly what I want to say before I say anything. It makes me slow sometimes, but it means I don't usually say the wrong thing. That's not a bad habit. It has its costs, she said. People think you're unbothered when you're not. They think, because you're not reacting, that it didn't land. He was quiet. Then did it land? She thought about Caleb's handwriting. Careful, slightly cramped script. Her physical condition. Yes, she said. It landed. He nodded. He didn't say he was sorry, or that Caleb was wrong, or offer any of the other things people say in those moments that are meant to help, but mostly just fill air. He just drove, and she appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. When they got back to Black Ridge, Walter was on the porch. This was new. He'd been inside for every day she'd been there, and before that, from what Grayson had told her, for months. But there he was, sitting in the porch chair that had been warped and unpainted when she arrived, and that Pete had quietly fixed 3 days ago without being asked. Walter was sitting in it with his coffee, looking out at the yard, doing nothing in particular. He looked at them when they pulled up. How's Margaret Brennan? He said. Grayson stopped. You knew we were going to see her? I heard you talking last night. He said it without apology. The walls in this house aren't as thick as they should be. He looked at Clara. She'll help? Yes, Clara said. Good. He looked back at the yard. Her husband Frank was a decent man. What Aldridge did to her was a disgrace. I should have done something about it 3 years ago, and I didn't. He picked up his coffee. I was too inside my own head. No one said anything about that. There was nothing to say about it that would make it better or worse, and all 3 of them seemed to understand this simultaneously. Clara went inside to start dinner. The response from Dr. Pierce came 6 days later. It was a longer letter than she'd expected, 4 pages, in a careful, slightly formal hand, the writing of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say and had said it precisely. He remembered Walter Hale clearly. He had treated Eleanor Hale in her final weeks and had made several house small testments during that period. And his professional assessment stated plainly, in terms that would hold up to scrutiny, was that Walter had been in a state of acute, grief-related cognitive impairment during the weeks immediately following Eleanor's death. He had documented this at the time, he wrote, because he believed in keeping thorough records, and those records were available. He also wrote, and this was the part that made Clara read the paragraph twice, that he had been present in Aldridge's office. On one occasion during that period, accompanying Walter at Walter's request, because Walter had said he didn't trust himself to understand legal documents and had wanted someone with him. He had not understood at the time what he was witnessing. He had thought it was routine business, but his presence had been documented in the office log, and he had a clear memory of Walter's condition that day, and he was prepared to provide a sworn statement to that effect. He had been a witness. Without knowing it, he had been there. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the letter and felt something shift in the architecture of the whole situation. This was the piece Aldridge hadn't accounted for. Not because he'd been careless, he'd been meticulous, but because he couldn't have predicted that a retiring country doctor would keep thorough records and would respond to a letter 8 years after the fact, with 4 pages of precise professional memory. She brought the letter to Grayson in his office. She set it on his desk and let him read it. She watched his face while he read. Watched the moment when he got to the paragraph about Dr. Pierce being present. Watched something in his jaw loosen that had been set hard for a very long time. He looked up. He was there. He was there, she said. Aldridge knows he was there. It's in the office log. Which means Aldridge knows his own documentation of that day includes a witness who can speak to your father's condition. She paused. He might have been counting on Dr. Pierce being too far away, or too old, or too disinterested to respond to a letter, or counting on no one thinking to write to him at all. He looked at the letter. This changes what going to court would cost him. Yes, she said. And there's something else. She told him then about what she'd been doing with the information from the land office and from Margaret Brennan, the pattern across all 4 properties, the connections she'd been mapping, potential to bring May Dempsey's account alongside Margaret's, alongside Dr. Pierce's account and present, not a single grievance, but a record of systematic conduct. She told him about the plan she'd been building carefully in the margins of her evenings for the past week, piece by piece. The way you build something that has to be solid before you trust any weight to it. He listened without interrupting. That was something she'd noticed about him when something genuinely held his attention. He went very still and listened completely, without the restless half-attention that most people gave you when they were waiting for their turn to speak. When she was done, he said, "When were you going to tell me all of this?" "When I had enough of it to be worth telling," she said. "I don't like presenting half a plan. That's twice. Now, you've done significant work on something that directly involves my family without telling me until it was already partly built." She looked at him. "Are you angry about that?" He thought about it. "No," he said, and seemed slightly surprised by his own answer. "I'm trying to figure out why I'm not." "Because it worked?" she offered. "Maybe." He looked at the letter. "Maybe because no one's ever done that before. Put that kind of work into something that wasn't their problem." "It is my problem," she said. "I live here. I work here. If Aldridge gets the East Quarter and the water rights, I lose the job. That's a practical stake." "That's not the only reason," he said. She didn't answer that. She picked up the letter and set it back on the desk. "Write to May Dempsey. I'll give you the address Margaret gave us. Then write to the lawyer in Colorado Springs again. Not the same letter, a different approach. Tell him you have a doctor's sworn statement and 2 corroborating accounts from other Aldridge transactions in this county. See if that changes his assessment of the case." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his pen. She went back to the kitchen. 3 days later, everything changed in a direction she hadn't anticipated. She was in town alone. Grayson was on the ranch dealing with a fence line that Pete and Arlo had flagged as urgent when she ran into Edmund Griggs. She had known this would happen eventually. Dust Creek was not large. She'd simply been out here often enough by now that the odds had caught up with her. He was coming out of the saloon when she was passing it, and he almost walked into her, and for a moment they were both standing on the boardwalk in the flat October light with approximately nothing between them. He looked different than she remembered from the stagecoach, or maybe she was just seeing him differently. He was not as large as she'd made him in her memory. He was a medium-sized, middle-aged man with a mediocre face and the slightly defensive posture of someone who is aware, on some level, that he does not always conduct himself well and has not found a satisfying way to live with that. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mr. Griggs," she said. He seemed to be waiting for something from her, anger, or tears, or recrimination, something he'd prepared a response to. She gave him none of it. She just looked at him the way you look at something you filed under irrelevant and moved on from. "I heard you're working at Hale's place," he said. "Yes, I didn't." He stopped, started again. "I should have written before you made the journey." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at his boots. "My situation changed quickly. The other arrangement." "Mr. Griggs," she said it quietly, without heat, "you don't owe me an explanation. I don't want one. What you did was unkind, and you know it was unkind. And I imagine you're aware of that without me saying so. I don't need you to feel worse about it. I just need you to step aside so I can get to the dry goods store." He stepped aside. She went to the dry goods store. She was almost at the counter when Ruth Calloway appeared from the back room with a box of something and stopped when she saw Clara's expression. "What happened?" Ruth said. "Nothing," Clara said. "I just ran into Edmund Griggs." Ruth set the box down. "Did he say something?" He apologized. "Sort of. Badly." She almost smiled. "It wasn't terrible." "High praise from you," Ruth said. And this time Clara did smile. A real one, which seemed to slightly startle Ruth, who smiled back. They had developed, over the past few weeks, a particular kind of friendship that happens between practical women in small towns, built on direct conversation, and the exchange of useful information, and the absence of any requirement to perform warmth you didn't feel. Ruth knew everything that happened in Dust Creek, processed it without drama, and shared what was relevant to who she thought needed it. Clara had come to value this in the way you value something rare. Owen Aldridge was in here yesterday, Ruth said, handing Clara the items she'd asked for one by one. In a mood. What kind of mood? The kind where a man who usually gets what he wants has started to feel like he might not get it this time. Ruth said it with the careful neutrality of someone describing something precisely. He was asking about Grayson, about what was happening out at the ranch, about who was living there. She glanced at Clara. About you specifically. Clara kept her expression level. What kind of questions? Where you came from? What your history was? Whether you had family in the area. Ruth set the last item on the counter. I told him you were a private person, and I wasn't in the habit of discussing my customers' business. Thank you. I also told him the coffee at the saloon was better than mine, which is a lie, but sent him there. She named the total. Clara paid it. He's going to push back harder, now that he knows Grayson has support. I know, Clara said. Be careful, Ruth said, not dramatically. Just as information, delivered in the same tone as the price of cornmeal. Clara walked back to the wagon. She sat there for a moment before driving. The October wind had picked up, and it had a cold edge to it that meant November was practicing its arrival. She thought about Aldridge asking about her, about where she'd come from, about her history. There wasn't much in her history that could hurt her, she thought. She was a woman who'd come west to marry someone who hadn't held up his end of the arrangement. She was employed at a respectable ranch. She'd been here long enough that people in town knew her face. But she thought about Caleb's letter. Her brother, who had written to Edmund Griggs without her knowledge, who had described her as a burden with a physical condition that made her unsuitable. If someone like Aldridge went looking for material to discredit her, and she now believed he would, because she had been visibly involved in organizing the response to his claim, and he was not the kind of man who missed things like that, Caleb's letter could be used. Not legally, not in court, but in the court of a small town's opinion. A letter from a family member describing a woman as unreliable and physically unsuitable could do damage. The kind of damage that was hard to undo because you couldn't disprove a feeling. She drove back to Black Ridge, and she went directly to her room, and she took Caleb's letter out of the trunk. She read it one more time. Then she sat at her desk, and she wrote a letter to her brother. Not the letter she'd imagined writing in the first days after finding it, the one that had been mostly hurt, mostly the sound of someone's demanding to understand how a person could do what he'd done. This was a different letter, shorter, more direct. She told him she'd found the letter he'd written to Edmund Griggs. She told him she was not writing to relitigate what he'd done or to ask him to defend it. She was writing because she wanted him to know that she was aware of it, that she was well, and that she was established in a situation she had no intention of leaving. She told him that the letter existed, and that she held it, and that if it were ever used against her in any context, she would ensure the full content of it, including its characterization of her as a burden, based on her appearance, was made available to anyone who might be interested. It wasn't a threat, it was information. She was particular about that distinction. She signed it, sealed it, and set it aside to post the next time she went to town. Then she felt, for the first time since finding it, that the letter had been properly dealt with. The lawyer in Colorado Springs wrote back within the week. His assessment had changed significantly. With a doctor's sworn statement establishing Walter Hale's compromised capacity, and with 2 corroborating accounts of similar conduct by the same creditor in the same county, he now believed there was a viable argument, not certain, but viable for challenging the enforceability of the balloon clause on the grounds of predatory practice. He also noted something Clara had not known. There was a new district judge recently assigned to the region named Hargrove, who had come from Denver and had no documented connection to Owen Aldridge whatsoever. Judge Beaumont still had jurisdiction, but jurisdiction could be challenged if there was demonstrable conflict of interest, and the 20-year social relationship between Beaumont and Aldridge, which the lawyer said he could document through fraternal organization records, was the kind of thing that gave a motion for recusal a fighting chance. He said he would need to come to Dust Creek in person. He said he needed 2 weeks to clear his calendar. He said the combined case, if they could get May Dempsey's account in writing before he arrived, would be significantly stronger. He said, I think you have something here. Clara read this letter at the kitchen table while Walter sat across from her with his coffee, watching her face. Good news, he said. Possibly, she said. She set the letter down. The lawyer thinks we have a case. A real one. Walter was quiet. He turned his cup in his hands. I want to be there. When it happens. Whatever happens. He looked at her. I've been letting Grayson carry this alone for 2 years because I couldn't find my way out of my own head. I'm not going to let him carry the end of it alone. He'll want that, Clara said. He won't say so, I know. He doesn't say most things. Walter looked at the window. He's like me that way. Eleanor used to say we were 2 pots that never boiled unless someone turned the heat up. He paused. She was the heat. Clara said, You're both doing better than you think you are. He looked at her. So are you, he said, in case nobody said it. She looked down at the lawyer's letter. Nobody had said it, actually. Not in those words. Not as a complete sentence directed specifically at her. She didn't say this. She just nodded and picked up the letter and started thinking about what needed to happen next. That evening, Grayson found her on the porch. Cold had come in properly now, and she had her coat on, sitting in the chair that had been warped and was now fixed, looking at the sky that was doing its enormous Colorado thing, in shades of orange and gray. He sat in the other chair, the one that had been empty every evening she'd been here. The lawyer's coming in 2 weeks, he said. Yes. May Dempsey wrote back. She'll give a statement. Good. He was quiet. Then Aldridge sent a man to the ranch today while you were in town. One of his hands. He left a message with Pete. She looked at him. Said Aldridge wants to meet. Says he has a modified offer. More favorable terms. More time on the note. He said it flat. He knows something's changed. He's trying to settle before it gets to a judge. Don't settle, Clara said immediately. He looked at her. Not yet, she said. Wait for the lawyer to get here. Wait until Aldridge knows exactly how much evidence you have. If he wants to settle now, it's because he's more worried than he's showing. Let him be worried for 2 more weeks. Then settle if the terms are right. Or go to court if they're not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not worried about taking it to court? I'm worried about it, she said. I'm just more worried about settling too early. She looked at the sky. Your mother Eleanor kept the original deed. The first 20 acres. She called it the beginning, Walter said. I've been thinking about that. She paused. You can't protect something if you don't know what it's worth. Not just financially, actually worth. He looked at her with that careful, measuring look that had stopped being the logistical assessment of those first days and had become something else, something she didn't entirely have a name for yet. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you were on that street, he said. That afternoon, when I drove past with the wagon, he said it simply, without decoration. I almost didn't stop. She thought about that for a moment. About the wagon. About the trunk that had been pulling her shoulder out of the socket. About the 30 seconds she'd given herself to feel how badly things had gone, and then the decision to think about what to do next. I'm glad you did, she said. Sky went from orange to deep gray, and the first stars came out over Black Ridge, cold and sharp and very far away. And they sat in the fixed chairs on the repaired porch of the ranch that was not going to be taken without a fight. And neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The lawyer's name was Edmund Farrow, and he arrived on a Thursday morning in a coat that was too thin for the Colorado November, and with a leather satchel so full of documents it had stopped closing properly. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, lean and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away in the way of men who have spent decades in rooms where giving things away is expensive. He shook hands. With Grayson at the door, nodded at Walter. And when he was introduced to Clara, he looked at her for a moment with the specific attention of someone assembling a more accurate picture than the one he'd arrived with. You're the one who built the case, he said. I gathered information, she said. You're the one who knows what to do with it. He looked like he appreciated the distinction. Let's sit down. They spread everything across the kitchen table. Dr. Pierce's letter. Margaret Brennan's signed account. May Dempsey's written statement, which had arrived 4 days earlier, and which was, as Margaret had predicted, the account of a woman who had been angry for 6 years, and was extremely precise about it. The land office records Clara had memorized and reconstructed from her notes. The original deed from Eleanor's box, Walter had insisted on including it, and Farrow had looked at it for a long moment and then set it carefully to one side. Farrow read everything, all of it. He asked questions as he went pointed, specific questions that showed he was already building the argument in his head as he read. He asked Clara 3 times to clarify things she'd written in her notes, and each time she answered without hedging, with the exact information she had, and nothing beyond it, and each time he made a note in his own hand on the papers in front of him. After about 2 hours, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "All right," he said, "here's what we have and what we don't have." He was matter-of-fact about it, which she appreciated. Some lawyers, she imagined, dress things up in either direction, overselling good news or softening bad. Farrow just said it. What we have is a documented pattern of conduct across 4 properties in the same county by the same creditor, using the same structural mechanism. We have a medical professional who was present at the signing and can speak to the signer's impaired capacity. We have 2 corroborating victim accounts. We have land office records showing the timing of Aldridge's acquisitions relative to each family's vulnerability. That's a meaningful body of evidence. Taken together, it's not one grieving widower who didn't read what he signed. It's a practice. Walter was sitting at the far end of the table. He'd been there for the whole 2 hours, quiet, with his coffee going cold in front of him. At the word practice, he made a sound, not quite a word. Just a short, controlled exhale through his nose. "What we don't have," Farrow continued, "is a sympathetic judge. Beaumont will rule against us. I'm confident of that. So the first motion before we even get to the substance of the case is a recusal motion. We file it. We document the 20-year social relationship. We demonstrate the pattern of rulings in Aldridge's favor, and we request that Judge Hargrove take the case instead." "Will that work?" Grayson said. "It has a reasonable chance. Hargrove is new to the region and has no stake in the existing arrangements. He's also, and this matter's known to be meticulous about procedure. A well-documented recusal motion is exactly the kind of thing a meticulous judge responds to." Farrow looked at his papers. "It's not certain. Nothing is certain. But it's the right first move. And if Beaumont refuses to recuse himself," Clara asked, "then we appeal the refusal before we even get to trial. It takes longer, but the appeal goes above Beaumont's jurisdiction, and the documentation we have is strong enough to support it." He looked at her. "That's the slower path. It might take 6 months instead of 6 weeks. What about the note?" Grayson said. "If this takes months, the filing of a legal challenge creates a stay on the foreclosure. Aldridge can't act on the note while the case is in process." Farrow gathered his papers into a rough pile. "He knows this, which is why he sent someone to offer you modified terms before I got here. He doesn't want this in front of a judge at all. He especially doesn't want it in front of a judge who doesn't owe him anything." The room was quiet for a moment. Walter spoke. "He knew when he offered that loan that I wasn't in a state to think clearly." He said it without drama, looking at the table. "I've known Owen Aldridge for 20 years. He came to Eleanor's funeral. He stood there with his hat in his hands and he said she was a fine woman, and the county was lesser for losing her. And then 6 weeks later he came to my house, and he put papers in front of me." He stopped. "I signed them because I didn't care what happened to anything. I want that on record somewhere. I didn't read them properly because I didn't care about anything enough to read it properly." Farrow looked at him. "That's exactly what I'll need you to say, in those words. Can you do that in front of a judge?" "I can do it in front of anyone," Walter said. "I've had 2 years to be ashamed of it. I'd like to do something useful with the shame." Farrow nodded once. He started writing. They worked for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. Clara made food at some point nobody asked her to. She just did it because the alternative was 4 people trying to think clearly on empty stomachs, and thinking clearly was the most important thing happening in the kitchen that night. She put soup on the stove and kept it going, and brought bowls to the table without interrupting anything. And Farrow ate his without looking away from the documents, which she took as a sign that he was properly focused. By 8 o'clock, they had the framework of the recusal motion and the outline of the main case, and Farrow had a clear list of what he still needed and what sequence he intended to file things in. He stayed the night in the spare room. At breakfast the next morning, he was already at the table with his papers, before anyone else was up. The filing happened the following week. Clara wasn't in the courtroom. For it, the recusal motion didn't require her presence, and Farrow had said clearly that the fewer people visible in the early stages, the better. She stayed at the ranch, and she cooked and she cleaned, and she did the things she'd been doing for 6 weeks, and she waited. The waiting was harder than the building had been. The building had kept her hands and her mind occupied simultaneously. The waiting was just time. 3 days after the filing, Grayson came back from town with the news that Beaumont had denied the recusal motion in about 4 hours, which was Farrow had apparently told him, roughly 4 hours faster than a properly considered ruling should take. He's not even trying to look impartial, Clara said. Farrow said the same thing. He said it's actually better for the appeal. The speed of the denial makes the conflict of interest more visible, not less. Grayson sat down at the table. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He looked tired in a specific way, not physically, but the way of someone who has been running on necessary adrenaline for weeks and has just been handed another obstacle when they were hoping for a clear path. He filed the appeal this morning. It goes to the territorial circuit. Could be 3 weeks, could be 6. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, like he was testing how it felt. You say that a lot. It's usually true. It's not always true. No, she agreed. But it's a useful thing to say while you're figuring out whether it is or not. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in the tired lines of his face shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one, underneath the surface. My mother used to say something like that. Different words. Same idea. She didn't say anything. She got up and got the coffee. He'd been doing that more lately, referencing Eleanor. Not heavily, not constantly, but in the natural way of someone who has rediscovered that talking about someone they've lost doesn't make the loss worse. Walter had started it, and Grayson had slowly followed, and she thought this was probably the most significant thing that had changed in the house since she'd arrived. Not the signed papers, not the legal case, not the cleaned rooms or the reliable meals. The fact that Eleanor Hale was being spoken about again at the kitchen table. The weeks that followed were not easy and not particularly dramatic in any moment-by-moment sense. They were the weeks of waiting and maintaining and keeping things running while something larger ground through its process at its own pace. Pete and Arlo kept working the cattle.
The fence line got repaired.
The first snow came and went and left the ranch looking clean and slightly foreign under the white. And then it melted, and everything went back to being the cold brown of late autumn. Clara got a letter from Caleb. She opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Walter's letter from her. He didn't ask what it was. She appreciated that. Caleb had written back. The letter was shorter than she'd expected and in a different register than anything he'd written before, less managed, less careful. He said he'd understood her message. He said he'd known at the time that what he'd done was wrong, and had told himself it was practical, and had let the practicality stand in for actually thinking about it. He said he wasn't sure what he was asking for from her. He said he hoped she was well. He did not say he was sorry, which she noticed. He was the kind of man for whom apologies were a concession rather than an acknowledgement, and she'd known this about him her whole life. This letter was as close as he would come. She wrote back 2 days later, a short letter. She told him she was well. She told him the arrangement she'd come west to enter had fallen through, but that she'd found work that suited her. She told him she did not require anything from him and wished him the same. She told him the letter he'd written to Edmund Griggs was still in her possession. She signed it and posted it, and she did not think about Caleb again for a long time. This was not for forgiveness, exactly. It was something more like a decision to stop letting him occupy space in her thinking that could be used for something else. She had too much that required her attention to keep turning that particular stone over. The circuit court's ruling came on a Wednesday, 5 weeks after Farrow had filed the appeal. The ruling was that the recusal motion had been denied prematurely and without sufficient written justification, and that the case was to be reassigned to Judge Hargrove, effective immediately. Grayson came home from town with the paper in his hand, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, and he read it aloud to Clara and Walter, not because they couldn't have read it themselves, but because reading it aloud made it real in a way that silent reading didn't. When he finished, Walter put both hands flat on the table. Not in celebration, more like a man steadying himself. Good, he said. One word. The kind of one word that has a great deal inside it. Farrow set the trial date for 3 weeks out. The week before the trial was when Aldridge made his next move, and it was the move that Clara had been anticipating and dreading in roughly equal measure, since the moment Ruth Calloway had told her he'd been asking questions about her in the general store. She found out about it from Ruth, which was fitting. She was in town for supplies, when Ruth pulled her aside with the particular purposeful efficiency of a woman who has urgent information and wants to deliver it cleanly. Aldridge has apparently been sharing a document with certain people in Dust Creek, not publicly, not formally, but in the way of a man who knows how to manage a community's opinion without appearing to. The document was a letter, her brother's letter, Not the original Aldridge couldn't have had the original. She still had it, but a copy, or a summary of it, that someone had clearly shared with him. Question of how was something she turned over quickly. Edmund Griggs. Caleb had written to Edmund. Edmund had presumably still had the letter, or had shared it with someone, or had described its contents in conversation, and it had made its way to Aldridge, who had been looking for exactly this kind of material. The document Aldridge was sharing characterized Clara as someone whose own family had deemed her physically and temperamentally unsuitable, that she had come west under false pretenses, that her presence at Black Ridge was irregular, and her role in the legal case was that of an outside agitator with no legitimate stake. Ruth told her this in a flat, clear voice, watching her face as she said it. Clara listened. She kept her expression level. Inside, she was doing something more complicated, not quite anger, not quite hurt, something between the two that was also mixed with a familiar tiredness. The specific tiredness of having her body used as an argument against the validity of everything else about her. Who has he shown it to? She asked. 3 men I know of. 2 of them are on the town council. One of them is a friend of Beaumont's. Ruth paused. It won't affect Hargrove. I don't think Aldridge is trying to affect the judge. I think he's trying to affect the witnesses. Clara looked at her. Margaret Brennan is already on the edge, Ruth said. She is almost nothing. If Aldridge makes it clear that the woman organizing this case has been described by her own family as unreliable, and if that gets back to Margaret and she starts to wonder whether she's backing the wrong side. I need to go see Margaret, Clara said. I think so, yes. She went that afternoon. She drove out to the small house at the end of the road that needed a better name, and she knocked on the door, and Margaret opened it and looked at her and said, simply, I heard. Can I come in? Yes. They sat at the same table as before. No coffee this time. Margaret had apparently forgotten to offer it, which was a sign of how unsettled she was, but because Margaret was a woman who offered coffee the way other people breathed. Tell me what you heard exactly, Clara said. Margaret told her. The details were slightly distorted in the way that things always are after they've passed through several pairs of hands, but the core of it was the same. A letter from her brother, a characterization of Clara as unsuitable, a suggestion that her motives in this case were unclear. Is it true? Margaret asked, not unkindly. The letter from your brother? There is a letter from my brother, Clara said. He wrote to the man I was supposed to marry and told him to end the arrangement. He described me as a burden. He said my physical condition made me unsuitable for frontier life. She paused. He wrote it because he wanted me gone from his life, and he found a polite way to arrange it. I found the letter here in Dust Creek, in the house of the man who was supposed to meet me. Margaret was quiet. I am not unsuitable, Clara said. I have been running a household and building a legal case and keeping 2 men from losing their family's land for 6 weeks. And I have done it on $41, and whatever they've paid me in wages and the willingness to do hard work without a guarantee of how it would end. She looked at Margaret directly. My brother's opinion of me is not a fact about me. It's a fact about him. The same way what Aldridge did to you is not a fact about you. It's a fact about him. Margaret looked at her hands on the table. I know you're afraid, Clara said. I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't be. You have very little left, and you're being asked to put it at risk again, in a system that failed you before. That's a real thing. I'm not going to minimize it. She paused. But Hargrove isn't Beaumont. Farrow isn't the lawyer you had before. And this time there are 4 of us instead of 1. And there's a doctor who was in the room when Walter Hale signed. And there's 8 years of land office records that show a pattern that didn't exist when you went to court alone. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind hit the side of the house and moved on. Your brother sounds like a small man, Margaret said. He's small in some ways, Clara said. He's not monstrous. He made a practical decision about a person without thinking of the person as a person. A lot of people do that. She looked at the table. Been thought of as an inconvenience by people who should have known better my whole life. I've decided I'm not going to let the accumulation of that change what I think I'm worth. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put one hand briefly over Clara's. Not a sentimental gesture. Margaret Brennan was not a sentimental woman. Just a hand placed there and then removed. I'll be at the trial, Margaret said. Clara drove back to Black Ridge in the cold. She told Grayson that evening about Aldridge circulating the summary of Caleb's letter. She told him plainly, without softening it, because he needed to know, and because she decided several weeks ago that the practice of telling him things only when she had a full plan was not serving either of them well. He listened, his jaw set in the way it did, when something made him angry, not dramatically, just this setting, like a door being locked. He's trying to shake the witnesses, he said. He's also trying to shake me, she said. In case I shake easily. He looked at her. Do you? She thought about 30 seconds on a street in Dust Creek. About a trunk that had been pulling her shoulder out of the socket. No, she said, but it costs something. I want you to know that. She looked at the table. I want you to know it's not nothing. Having someone use your family's opinion of you as a weapon. Even if the weapon doesn't work. He was quiet for a moment. I know it's not nothing, he said. He didn't say anything else. But later that evening, when she was in the kitchen banking the stove for the night, he came in and set a piece of paper on the counter beside her and left without a word. She picked it up. It was a letter. His handwriting the same deliberate, slightly angular hand she'd seen on the ranch documents. It was addressed to no one in particular. It said, Clara Whitmore has been employed at Black Ridge Valley Ranch since October of this year. In that time, she has demonstrated exceptional competence, sound judgment, and a quality of character that reflects well on anyone associated with her. Any document or account suggesting otherwise is mistaken. Anyone with questions about her standing in this community may direct them to Grayson Hale or Walter Hale, Black Ridge Valley, Dust Creek, Colorado Territory. She stood in the kitchen and read it twice. It was not a romantic letter. It was not a declaration of anything except the plain facts as he saw them. It was the letter of a practical man who had found the most direct, available way to do something that mattered. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She thought she might keep it for a long time. The trial came on a Thursday. The courtroom in Dust Creek was a plain room with a low ceiling and benches that had been built for utility rather than comfort. It was full. She hadn't anticipated that she'd known the case had generated attention in the county, but seeing it translated into actual bodies in the room was different. Margaret was there in the second row, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. Ruth Calloway was there, which Clara had not expected, sitting near the back with the alert expression of a woman who considers it her professional responsibility to witness things. Several other faces she recognized from town. A few she didn't. Owen Aldridge was at the opposing table with two lawyers, and the smooth, settled expression of a man who has sat in rooms like this before and come out the way he intended to. Judge Hargrove was younger than she'd expected. Somewhere in his 40s, with a methodical manner of moving through the room that suggested he had brought his own standards with him and was going to apply them regardless of what the existing arrangements were. Farrow had told them beforehand not to show anything in their faces. Not satisfaction when something went well, not concern when it didn't. Appearance of confidence without performance was the goal. She had told Grayson the same thing in slightly different words, and he had nodded in the way of someone who has always known this, but appreciated having it said aloud. The opening arguments were precise and careful, and Farrow gave his the same way he'd done everything without drama, building the structure clearly so that any paying attention person in the room could follow the logic. He laid out the pattern across all 4 properties. He named the dates. He named the families. He described the mechanism, the vulnerability, the better-than-bank terms, the carefully timed balloon clause in language that was plain enough that it needed no interpretation. Aldridge's lawyers objected twice during Farrow's opening. Hargrove overruled both times with the brief, practiced expression of a judge who is going to let an argument be made before he decides what to do with it. Dr. Pierce testified first. He had come from Pueblo in person, which Clara had not known he would do. She had assumed a sworn statement would be submitted. But he was there in his 60s, with the careful diction of a man who has testified before and understands the weight of precise language in a legal setting. He described Walter Hale's condition in the weeks following Eleanor's death. He described the day in Aldridge's office. He described what he had observed with the clinical specificity of a physician, the slowed responses, the flat affect, the signed documents that Walter had not appeared to read, the sense throughout of a man present in the room, but not entirely present inside himself. Aldridge's lawyers cross-examined him for 20 minutes. They got nothing useful out of it. Dr. Pierce was not a man who could be rattled, and every question they asked, he answered with the same careful precision he'd used on direct examination. Margaret testified second. She was clear, she was specific. She was angry in the contained, precise way of someone who has been waiting 3 years for the correct venue in which to be angry, and it came through not as emotion but as detail. Every detail of her transaction with Aldridge remembered and recounted with a specificity that was impossible to dismiss as grievance or confusion. May Dempsey had submitted a sworn written statement. Farrow read it into the record. It was 6 pages long and covered every dimension of the Dempsey transaction with the thoroughness of a woman who had been composing it in her head for 6 years and was not going to leave anything out. Walter testified last. He walked to the stand without assistance, which she'd been slightly worried about. He'd been having a bad knee since the cold set in. He sat down. He looked at the room once, found her face in the second row where she sits beside Grayson, and then he looked at Farrow, told the truth. He said it the way he'd said it at the kitchen table. The night Farrow arrived. Without drama, without self-pity, without any attempt to make himself appear better than he'd been. He said he had not read the papers properly. He said he had not cared about anything enough to read them properly. He said he had trusted Owen Aldridge because of 20 years of acquaintance, and because Aldridge had come to his wife's funeral and stood with his hat in his hands and said she was a fine woman. And because when you are in the condition he was in, you trust the familiar face, even when you shouldn't. He said, I want it on record that the problem was not that I didn't understand the words. Problem was that I had signed my name to things while I was not truly in a state to be held to them, and the man across from me knew that, and he used it. He said it to Hargrove, and Hargrove wrote something down. Aldridge's lawyers cross-examined Walter for 35 minutes, and they were not gentle about it. They suggested he was retrospectively reinterpreting a legal transaction because it had become inconvenient. They suggested that grief was not a legal incapacity. They suggested that a man of his experience and years should be held to the documents he signed regardless of his emotional state. Walter answered every question in the same even tone. He did not get flustered. He did not get emotional. He was the opposite of emotional. He was so controlled and specific and clear that the more aggressive the questioning became, the worse Aldridge's lawyers looked for asking it. Grayson did not testify. Farrow had made the decision that Walter was the more powerful witness for the core argument, and that Grayson's testimony would be cumulative rather than additive. It had been hard for Grayson to accept this. She knew sitting in the room while his father did something Grayson felt he should be doing himself. But he sat there and he was still, and he let his father have the stand, and she thought it was one of the better things she'd seen him do. Hargrove recessed for 2 hours after testimony closed. They sat in the hallway on the bench outside the courtroom. All 4 of them, Clara, Grayson, Walter, and Farrow, who was reviewing his notes with the systematic calm of a man who has done everything he could and is now engaged in the different work of waiting. Nobody talked much. Walter had a cup of coffee someone had brought him, and he drank it slowly. Margaret sat nearby, not with them exactly, but adjacent, in the way of someone who is part of a thing, but hasn't quite decided to claim membership in it yet. At one point, in the middle of the second hour, Walt said, without looking at anyone in particular, Eleanor would have had opinions about all of this. Good opinions or bad ones? Grayson said. Both, Walter said. She'd have told you to sit up straighter. She'd have told Farrow his tie was wrong. She'd have been furious at Aldridge, and she would have handled the fury by making everyone around her eat something. He paused. And she would have liked Clara. Very much. Clara looked at the floor. She would have said, Walter continued, that anyone who misses what's obvious about that woman isn't paying proper attention. Grayson said nothing, but his shoulder, which had been set in its careful, held posture for the entire morning, dropped slightly. Just slightly. Just enough that she could see it. Hargrove's ruling took an additional 40 minutes after he returned to the bench. He did not rule in a dramatic fashion. He read the ruling in the same methodical way he'd conducted the entire proceeding. He found, in summary, the following: that the evidence presented established a documented pattern of predatory lending by the creditor across multiple transactions in this county, that the testimony of the medical professional who had been present at the signing credibly established that the signer had been in a compromised state, that the combination of the ends factors constituted sufficient grounds to void the balloon clause of the note on the basis that it had been executed under conditions the creditor had deliberately cultivated, and that the underlying debt, the actual loan amount, properly calculated at the agreed rate, remained valid and was to be refinanced through the county bank on standard terms within 60 days. East Quarter Section was not forfeit. The water rights remained with Black Ridge Valley. Owen Aldridge was further ordered to submit to a review of his other county property transactions by a territorial oversight committee, the results of which would be forwarded to the district attorney. Clara heard all of this. She processed it in the specific way. She processed information that mattered completely, and without visible reaction, filing it, understanding what it meant, letting the full shape of it settle in before she responded to any of it. What it meant was they had won. Not perfectly, the debt remained. The refinancing was a real obligation. Nothing had been free or simple, but the ranch was intact. The water rights were intact. Walter's signature on a document he'd been too broken to read properly was not going to cost his son the thing they'd spent 30 years building. Beside her, she felt rather than saw Grayson exhale. A single long breath that seemed to release something he'd been holding since before she arrived. Walter set his coffee cup down on the bench beside him with the same careful, deliberate exactness he put into everything, and then he folded his hands in his lap and looked at the floor. After a moment, he said, very quietly, "All right, Eleanor. All right." She pretended not to hear that. Some things were private, even in a crowded hallway. The room cleared slowly. Aldridge left without looking at any of them, a man who has miscalculated something significant and is already working out how to proceed, which meant he would not disappear. And they all knew it. The immediate problem had been resolved, and the future problems would have to be handled as they came. Margaret stopped in front of Clara on her way out. "You were right," she said, "about it being different this time." "We were right," Clara said. "You were the one who showed up." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "Come and see me," she said, "when this is settled. Come for coffee." She said it the way some people offer something they mean not as a formality but as an actual thing, extended and waiting to be taken. "I will," Clara said. Ruth Calloway appeared from somewhere in the crowd and caught her eye and gave her a single nod, the nod of a woman who considered the day's business concluded satisfactorily and had already moved on to whatever came next. Dr. Pierce shook her hand before he left. He held it a moment longer than a formal handshake and said, "You remind me of my wife. She solves things the same way." From the edges inward, he released her hand. "It's a good method." She thanked him, and he went to catch his transport back to Pueblo. Farrow stayed long enough to go over the practical details of the refinancing with Grayson, dates, amounts, what documentation the bank would need, and then he packed his impossible satchel and said he'd send a final account of his fees in writing, and that it had been the most interesting case he'd worked in 3 years, and he left. Then it was just the three of them in the emptied hallway. Grayson looked at his father. Walter looked at his son. They were not men who hugged. That much was clear. But Grayson put his hand on his father's shoulder just briefly, the weight of a hand and then gone, and Walter put his own hand over it for the 2 seconds it was there. That was what it looked like, in that family, when something enormous had been felt and acknowledged and filed in the right place. Clara looked at the courtroom door. She thought about the woman who had stood on a street in October with a trunk that was pulling her shoulder out of the socket, and 30 seconds to feel how badly everything had gone before she started thinking about what to do next. She thought about what that woman had known and not known. She had known she was capable, and had known she had nowhere to go, and had known that giving up was not actually an option if she was being honest about herself. She had not known about Walter's coffee preferences, or Eleanor's wooden box, or Grayson's careful locked doorway of caring about things. She had not known about Owen Aldridge, or the East Quarter Section, or a retired doctor in Pueblo who kept thorough records out of professional habit. She had not known that a job she'd taken in 45 seconds, because it was concrete and available, was a thing she would fight for, like it was her own. The wagon ride back to Black Ridge was quiet. All three of them in it. Walter had declared he was not staying in town any longer than necessary, and had climbed up before anyone could suggest otherwise. The sky was the hard, clear blue of a Colorado winter afternoon, the kind that looks cold from inside and is colder than it looks from outside. Way home, Walt said from the back of the wagon, "I want to plant the south kitchen garden in spring. Eleanor had it in lavender and I let it go to weeds." He said it like a statement of fact, not a question. I'll need help with the planning of it. I can help with that, Clara said. I know you can, he said, in the tone of a man who considers this already settled. She looked at the road. Grayson glanced at her. She looked back at him. He looked away first, which was unusual. He was not generally a man who looked away first. When they got back to the ranch, there was work waiting, because there was always work waiting. Pete and Arlo came out of the barn with a question about the east fence that needed an answer. The stove had gone cold because no one had been there to maintain it. The horses needed attention. It was ordinary. All of it was just ordinary, pressing immediate work. Which was, she had come to understand this, exactly what a life looked like from the inside, when you were actually inside one. She went to the kitchen and got the stove going. After dinner, which was late because of the day, and at which all three of them were too tired to be particularly conversational, Grayson walked her to the door of her room the way he'd been doing for several weeks now, not every night. Just some nights when the day had been long enough that some kind of acknowledgement of it felt necessary before sleep. He stopped at the door. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. The way this ranch runs now, he said, is different from how it ran before October. Not just the legal situation, all of it. He was looking at the wall beside her door, which was his way of working through something out loud without making too much eye contact while he did it. My father is on the porch in the mornings. He's talking about the South Garden. He said something yesterday about getting a different breed of cattle for the east pasture next year, which means he's thinking about next year, which he hasn't been doing. He paused. That's not the legal case. That's something else. I know, she said. I don't want that to end. He said it to the wall first, and then he looked at her. I know that's not. I know this started as employment. I know you didn't come here planning any of this. Came here with $41 and nowhere particular to be, she said. Everything else I came to on purpose. He was quiet. I make decisions deliberately, she said. You've seen that. I don't drift into things. She looked at him. I'm still here deliberately. He took a slow breath. Would you stay? Past the wage arrangement. What started it? He was watching her face the way he'd learned to watch it, not for the surface of it, but for whatever she allowed to be visible underneath. Would you stay as someone who belongs here? The way Walter belongs here, the way I do. It was not a speech. It was not romantic in any performed sense. It was a man who did not have a lot of words for feelings using the words he had, and saying them anyway because saying them was necessary. She thought about Edmund Griggs, who hadn't looked at her when he spoke. She thought about Caleb's letter, with its careful, polite language that meant she was a problem. She thought about every room she'd walked into where the air changed. She thought about a kitchen with a stove that took 3 tries to light, and a wooden box with a pressed flower in it, and an old man who talked about horses he'd had for 16 years. Yes, she said, not dramatically, just the word, placed in front of him the way she placed things deliberately, with the full weight of having considered it. He nodded. And then, unexpected enough that she didn't have time to form any particular expression about it, he took her hand, just her hand. Both of his wrapped around it and held it for a moment the way his father had held the coffee cup that morning in the hallway, like something worth being careful with. Then he let go and said good night and went to his own room. She stood in her doorway for a moment. She went inside. She sat at her desk, where her notes were still spread from the weeks of case building, all those careful pages in her own handwriting. She picked them up and stacked them neatly and set them aside. She opened the wooden box that Walter had given her, Eleanor's real account book, and she looked at the pressed flower and the ring too small for any of Walter's fingers, and the photograph of a woman who had been caught mid-law and hadn't quite recovered. She thought about what Eleanor had called it, the beginning, the record of where you started, so you could measure how far you'd gone. Picked up her own pen, and she turned to a fresh page in her journal, and she wrote at the top, in her clear, practical hand, October. And then she started writing. Not the legal notes, not the household accounts, the actual record. The one that told Todd truth of how things had happened, not the official version, not the version that made anyone look better than they'd been, but the version where a woman got off a stagecoach with $41 and was looked past like a fence post and didn't cry and went looking for what came next. She wrote for a long time. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and cold, and the stars were doing what they always did over Black Ridge, burning their steady, indifferent light over the ranch and the fixed porch, and the south garden that would be lavender again in spring, over the east quarter section where the water rights were still intact. Over two men who had found their way back to being a family, and a woman who had found her way into one. She had not come to Dust Creek looking for any of this, but she had come with her eyes open and her back straight and the stubborn particular conviction that other people's assessments of what she was worth were their problem and not hers. And here, in the end, is what she had learned or not learned exactly, because she had always known it, but had it confirmed in the way that living through something confirms what you only believed before. The world is full of men like Edmund Griggs, who look past you because looking at you would require them to reckon with what they see, and full of men like Owen Aldridge, who calculate the precise moment of your weakness and position themselves to profit from it, and full of people like Caleb, who make practical decisions about other people without having the courage to look at them as people first. None of that is new. None of it will stop. What matters, the only thing, finally, that matters is what you do with your 30 seconds. The 30 seconds. When you've felt the full weight of how badly something has gone and you're still standing in the street with your trunk and you have to decide whether to collapse under what other people have decided about you or to pick up the weight and start walking toward whatever comes next. Clara Whitmore had always picked up the weight. She had not always known where she was walking. She had not always been sure of the ground. She had made wrong calls and slow calls, and calls that cost her things she hadn't expected to lose. But she had kept walking, and the walking had brought her here, to a kitchen that smelled of coffee, and a house that had warmth in it again, to a man who had handed her a letter that said she was worth defending, to an old man who talked to his dead wife in courthouse hallways and was already planning a garden, to a wooden box with a pressed flower that someone had kept because beginnings matter. She kept writing. The lamp burned low, and she trimmed it and kept writing. She was not finished yet. There was still a great deal ahead, the refinancing, and the spring planting, and whatever Aldridge would try next, and all the ordinary, relentless, specific work of a life that has decided to be lived in a particular place with particular people. None of it would be smooth. None of it would be certain. But she was in it now, deliberately and entirely in it. And that, she thought, setting her pen down finally, as the lamp guttered toward its last, that was the only kind of belonging that had ever been worth a thing. Not the belonging that someone grants you. The belonging you build, piece by piece, with your own hands, in the place you chose to stay.